Hello there, this is Kimberly Wilson, and welcome to the 478th edition of Tranquility du Jour, bringing you tranquility since 2005. Tranquility du Jour is a series of nourishing conversations about living a full and meaningful life infused with, of course, doses of tranquility. In this week's edition, I chat with Dr. Stuart Eisendrath about depression as an illness, not a personal weakness, how mindfulness helps with depression, and ways that depressive moods are similar to the weather. Basically, ladies, they are always in flux. Listeners, if you are new to Tranquility du Jour, you will find a Learn More Here link over in the show notes, which can be found at kimberlywilson.com/478. Stay tuned for the upcoming 6-week Tranquility Salon Online featuring all 6 tenets of Tranquility du Jour. Also, our next free seasonal offering is March 22nd, so save the date. And also consider taking one of the last 2 rooms available for Tranquility du Jour Provence. So let me tell you a little bit about this experience. Picture yourself enveloped in a charming, luxurious villa dating back to the 17th century. Surrounded by vineyards, olive groves, centuries-old oaks, lavender, and rosemary, the villa is nestled in the south of France between Nice and Marseille. Savor the perfect mix of practice, play, and relaxation, with space to lounge about the pool, wander in the countryside, and enjoy excursions to breathtaking vistas, including Grasse to make your very own custom perfume, and the Grand Canyon of Europe, and more. You can learn more about this retreat at kimberlywilson.com/Provence2020. Dr. Eisendrath is the author of When Antidepressants Aren't Enough and the founding director of the University of California San Francisco Depression Center. A senior clinician and research psychiatrist at UCSF, his lectures on mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for University of California TV has been viewed more than 1.5 million times. Visit him online at stuarteisendrath.com, StuEisendrath.com. Welcome, Stuart.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's a treat to have you, and congrats on your new book, When Antidepressants Aren't Enough, Harnessing the Power of Mindfulness to Alleviate Depression. So tell us a little bit about your book and what inspired you to write this.
I have been working with depressed people throughout my career as a psychiatrist, and I was the founder of the UCSF Depression Center, where we had a substantial number of patients coming through who had significant depression despite various trials with antidepressants. And so we wanted to really provide an alternative for them. And we started the program Practicing Alternatives to Heal Depression, and that featured mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And the real driving factor for this was that antidepressants can be life-saving for certain people and be very helpful. But unfortunately, if you look at the population, about only 30% of people will fully recover after a course of an antidepressant. And if you give a second antidepressant to people, only about 50% will have recovered in total. So that means 50% haven't recovered, and you really need something to try to help those people. And that was the impetus for our research and the impetus for this book.
So you mentioned mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, right? MBCT. And I'm very familiar with MBSR, trained with Jon Kabat-Zinn, and find this work to be absolutely magical. And I've been wanting to dive into more of the MBCT. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about what MBCT is?
Well, MBCT is a is related to MBSR. It's kind of like a cousin, only MBSR focuses on a broad range of different stress-related problems. So it can be anything from cancer to heart disease to anxiety and so on. But MBCT focuses really on depression and anxiety. And mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is a blend of some cognitive therapy principles along with mindfulness meditation. And it brings those together in a new way and helps people start to relate differently to their depressive thoughts and feelings and anxious thoughts and feelings. So instead of being sort of stuck with those depressive thoughts, for example, they're able to change their relationship to them.
And that's one of the big things you talk about, right, is changing our relationship to depression and to negative feelings. And can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that? So it's not so much changing depression, changing negative feelings, it's changing our relationship to it. So can you describe what the difference is kind of between that?
One way I like to think of it as if you're walking down the street and in a small town and you see a series of stores, in each storefront as you walk down, if you're depressed, you'll see a depressive thought or feeling. Now, in traditional cognitive therapy, you'll go into the store and try to argue, in essence, with those negative thoughts and try to come up with alternative or more balanced thoughts. That isn't the way it works in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. In that approach, you walk down the street, you notice the negative thought, but you don't have to go in and buy the thought. You can instead notice the thought, but keep walking down the street to wherever you want to go. Maybe you'll come by another store and see another negative thought. And instead of going in and buying that thought and taking it with you, you can really notice the thought, but keep going. So that's what I mean by changing your relationship. The negative thoughts are still there. They don't magically go away forever, but you don't have to be bogged down with them so that they rule your life.
Talk a little bit about mindfulness here. Okay, so I think our listeners know what mindfulness is, but just in case, would you mind giving a definition of how you describe it and encourage patients to use it, and maybe a little bit of the research behind it?
Well, mindfulness can be defined in various ways. I like to think of it as being aware of what you're experiencing as you're experiencing it and withholding judgment about that experience. So it really is noticing what's present right now in this moment. And as you do so, being able to be in a position to view that from an observer position. Now, the research on it has shown that taking that type of position, that mindfulness, and in our research we found that mindfulness-based cognitive therapy helped people with depression and anxiety. After 8 weeks of treatment, people's depression levels went down, their anxiety levels went down, their rumination levels went down, and their self-compassion and mindfulness increased. So it was very useful for people with depression and anxiety. And this was in a somewhat difficult to treat population. In our research, we only took people who had failed to recover despite 2 or more antidepressant trials. So these were people who hadn't done that well with antidepressants and needed something else. And the mindfulness was very helpful in giving them that and empowering them with tools that they could take with them wherever they go.
Can you share a little bit about these tools, right? Because I know in MBSR, we have a lot of weekly homework in the 8 weeks, and I assume it's probably the same with MBCT. And I would think that probably your clients who don't go through your 8-week program, you probably share these tools also. So what are some kind of your favorite mindfulness go-to tools that our listeners could try?
If they go to my website, www.stuarteisendrath.com, they can find free meditations that they can download or stream. And they're really tied to a chapter in the book but they can try them without the book. And these are fairly brief meditations that can help people get a taste for what mindfulness meditation are like. One of the most favored that I find, and that many people in our program have found, is a 3-minute meditation where you begin by focusing on your breath, your body sensations, and then basically shift to focus on one spot in your body, narrowing your focus to one spot, and then finally, in the last minute, expanding your awareness to the body as a whole. And what this does is help the person come to the present moment, to sensations, thoughts, and feelings that are present, and really focus for just 3 minutes. And it's a meditation that can be done anywhere, while you're sitting on a bus, while you're at a train station, while you're on an airplane, or while you're even at work. So it's something that can be done very easily and rapidly, and it serves to take you out of being focused on the past or the future and just come to the present moment. And this is important because what we find is that people with depression often are time travelers, as it were. They're focused on the past, and they feel as if they've experienced a loss, some loss of a loved one, a relationship, money, a job, some type of loss. Whether that's actually true or not remains to be decided. But the people with anxiety tend to focus on the future, that some disaster is looming in the future. And so if you can focus on the present moment, it is naturally antidepressant and anti-anxiety, because you're not thinking about the past or the future. You're just thinking about what's present right now. And that 3-minute breathing space helps bring that together in a very concise manner.
I think that's always such a great reminder of how we have this at our fingertips all the time, right? We don't have to roll at a yoga mat or go to a meditation studio. It's like, okay, just being with the breath and the body for a few minutes can have a pretty profound effect.
I've done it while I'm on hold waiting for tech support. It's something you can do. You can fit in many places in your daily life.
You know what I love too is you have a chapter called Your Mind is Not Always Your Friend and Thoughts Are Not Facts. How to Befriend the Observing Self. So these 2 chapters are really wonderful because I think that it's challenging for many people to recognize that, okay, thoughts are not necessarily reality. And one of my favorite tools is the practice of take your thoughts to court. Do you know beyond a reasonable doubt that this is true? And so I'm curious, what are some of your go-tos on helping people to recognize that thoughts are not facts and how to befriend this observing self?
Well, I like your analogy of going to court. That's really exactly the kind of thing we're talking about as well, that the thoughts are not facts, and particularly the ones you may hold most dearly are often not facts. So we advocate really trying to look at thoughts from a slightly different perspective. For example, we know the top 30 thoughts that people with depression have. It's been already established. And for any one person, they tend to have their top 10 thoughts, the top 10 negative thoughts that they have, sort of like a Letterman's top 10 of negative thoughts. And so if you're depressed, you're going to have these thoughts. And once you start to realize thoughts are not facts, in essence, they're symptoms. So when you notice, I'm having the thought I'm being rejected, for example, or I'm having the thought that I'm not a good person, I'm having the thought I'll never succeed. If you believe those thoughts, you'll get more depressed. And that's what happens. You get, when you're depressed, you generate negative thoughts, and in turn, those negative thoughts spiral back and generate more depression. And what mindfulness-based cognitive therapy does is break up that link. So when you have a negative thought, you can step back from it and observe you're having a thought. And those thoughts, you can start to notice, are really just symptoms of depression. Just as much as when you're depressed, you may have trouble sleeping or change in appetite or a slowing down, a lack of energy. Well, those are physical symptoms of depression, but there are also mental symptoms, cognitive symptoms, like those negative thoughts. And once you realize that, it puts you in a position to react differently to them. So instead of merely reacting, you can respond to them. There's my thought about being rejected. There's my thought about never being successful. And those are thoughts. And you can tell they're really just thoughts because when you're not depressed, you can ask yourself how much you believe the thoughts. So you tend to believe them when you're depressed, but you know, if you can remember, that when you're not depressed, you don't believe those at all. So that proves they're not facts. They're just based on an opinion at one point in time. So our thoughts really are opinions. If we look at a chair, for example, I may say that chair is beautiful. You may say that chair is ugly, but the only fact is it's a chair. And sometimes that isn't even a fact. But those different thoughts we have are just opinions about it, not facts. And in depression, you tend to generate a lot of negative thoughts. And when you're able to start realizing those are symptoms, it puts you in a much better position to deal with them.
And another piece that you talk about here is anxiety, of course. And you mentioned already that it's the overthinking oftentimes about the future. And you note this in the book as depression's frequent partner. And I'm curious because one of the things that comes up a lot for people is this rumination. And it could be rumination clearly on past events, but also rumination and getting stuck in the cycle of worry. What if? And how do you encourage people to kind of break that cycle?
Several things. First of all, if you're able to come to the present moment for either depression or anxiety, it really helps break up rumination. And by that, it does it in the way of if your mind is taken up with the present moment, you don't have the bandwidth, to borrow from computer terminology, you don't have the bandwidth to be focused on the past or the future. So focusing on the present moment is an excellent way of breaking up rumination. And in fact, in our research, we measured rumination specifically because rumination is the biggest driver of depression. And particularly in women, the women have more of a tendency to ruminate than men do for some reason. It's not clear exactly why, but it is clear that they do. And so if you start to focus on something, and there's been some really interesting research, even focusing on a sound for 30 minutes a day can have a dramatic impact on breaking up rumination. So just focusing on something, bringing your attention to something, whether it's the breath, sounds, body sensations, going through a body scan where you pay attention to the sensations throughout the body, helps you break up rumination, and that can be very powerful. The second thing about this is that as you start to shift your mind into being in an observing role, where you can observe what's going on, you can start to notice that you're having the same kinds of thoughts about the future or the past. So it's like if you've seen the movie Gone with the Wind, it can be very dramatic and exciting the first time you've seen it. But after you've seen it for 10 times, it kind of loses its magic. And once you apply that same kind of process to the thoughts you're having, it's the same thing. If you say, there I go again with my worrying thoughts about a disaster happening to my children, or I'm ruminating about this past argument I had with a person and how I should have responded, but I didn't. And if I had, what would have happened, and so on. So as you bring your attention to notice that you're having certain thoughts, you can start to notice there's a pattern to them and they have a certain familiarity. It's like going in to watch a movie. If you go and notice what kind of movies you go to, you have a tendency to go see the same kind of movies. And that, in essence, is what you're doing with your thoughts. You're going in to see the same kind of movie, the same kind of thought. And it may be a disaster thought that you're going to. You may not have even realized you like disaster movies, but that's what you've been doing with your thoughts about the future. One woman we had come into one of our groups came in saying, I wish I could get rid of my anxious thoughts. I worry constantly about my children. She had 3 children. If my son goes out on a date on Saturday night, I worry that he's going to have a car crash. I start to worry if I should call the hospitals. And I just can't take it. And what she learned in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is that you can't get rid of those thoughts. Trying to get rid of them doesn't work. Suppressing thoughts doesn't work. But rather, you could start changing your relationship to the thoughts. And so she became able to say, I'm having an anxious thought again, but it's just an anxious thought. I don't have to believe it. It's, again, an example of my mind not being my friend. And she became much more able to observe herself having the anxious thoughts. And paradoxically, by not trying to get rid of them, they faded into the background. They were still present, but it was like a radio being turned down. So they were playing in the background, but she could get on with her life and not be bogged down with those anxious thoughts.
That's such a great example. Thank you. I'm sure many listeners can relate to that of, the mind goes down the roller coaster of, it's not just that he's out on a date and maybe something could happen or he'll be late. It's like, no, it's a car crash and he's at the hospital, right? It's the catastrophizing.
Exactly.
Now, the great news is the last part of the book is lasting ways to achieve happiness. So you talk a bit about compassion, self-compassion, and, the difference between pain and suffering, acceptance. So can we talk a little bit about this? How do you recommend that we work on achieving kind of a little bit more stabilization, maybe, right? So that one of the things you talk about in the book is how moods are like weather patterns, right? They're constantly shifting. And so maybe rather than having quite so many storms, it's a little more, like even kill weather.
Yes, there's a lot in there, what you said. It's a lot of territory. Maybe I'll take up a couple of them. And if you want to go into some of the others, we can probe that a little more. I think of mindfulness as being something where you shine the searchlight of attention on something. It may be on your breath. It may be on your body sensations. Whatever you're focusing on, you decide where you want to focus. I think of self-compassion as being a very important part of this process. So in one of our individuals, he finished the 8-week program, and he said, I guess if I can forgive myself for my mind wandering, which minds tend to do, that maybe I can forgive myself for other things. And he started to be kinder and gentler to himself. And people with depression tend to be very harsh critics of themselves. So when this is the way I think of it as working. When you're shining the spotlight of attention on something, you can put a colored lens of self-compassion into the path of that searchlight, and then shine the light of attention and self-compassion to the process. So the way it works is like this. If I make a mistake, if I'm depressed, I may say, boy, what a dummy I am. I'll never be successful, and be very critical of myself. If I'm applying that lens of self-compassion, I can say, I made a mistake. That's what humans do. Humans make mistakes. And I can learn from my mistakes so that next time I won't do that, but I'm not a bad person because I did that. In fact, it really shows my common humanity with the millions and billions of other people who make mistakes. And the same thing goes for depression. Right now, there are 300 million people in the world, 300 million, according to the World Health Organization, who are suffering from depression. So if you're depressed, you're not alone. You're not a bad person. You're really like the other 300 million people. You're having a bout of depression. It's painful. I won't say that it isn't, but it isn't that you're a bad person or you're morally weak. You're having an illness like other people have an illness of diabetes or cancer or coronary artery disease. But incidentally, depression is the most disabling of all of those, more disabling than cancer or coronary artery disease. So depression is really a major problem, but it's part of a common experience that many people have.
Now, one of the things you talk about is achievements divided by expectations equals happiness. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that?
That formula I found to be very helpful in my career. It started really with, I used to consult to the intensive care unit in the general hospital, the medical surgical intensive care unit. And I met with the nurses every week. And one week I came by and the nurses were generally depressed, and which was unusual for them. And when I asked about what was going on, they said, well, they had several patients who died that week. And as we explored it, we began to understand that their expectation was that they should be able to save every patient. And of course, this was the intensive care unit, which meant they had the sickest patients in the hospital, and that unfortunately some of those patients were going to die. They weren't always savable or salvageable. And once they sort of realized that that had been their expectation, even outside of their awareness, they were expecting that they could really shift their expectation to they'll try to save everyone who can be saved. But for those who can't be saved, they could provide death with dignity and help for the family to go through the dying process. And by getting their expectations in line, they were and in line with what they could achieve, they became much happier in their work setting and less burnt out. So that same thing applies with depression. For example, in depression, people tend to amplify their expectations. They tend to think of the expectation as being perfection. I should be perfect. Shoulding on themselves. And at the same time, they minimize their own achievement. So they have a minimal achievement in the numerator and a high perfection expectation in the denominator, so they feel poorly about themselves. And one thing they need to do is to get that expectation back into alignment and really also simultaneously look at the achievement as in a more realistic way. And as they make those two adjustments, they can start to feel better and actually happier in their life.
Yeah, I think so much boils down to expectation, doesn't it?
A great deal.
And one other thing that you talk about here that I just want to touch on because I do think it's really important is acceptance. And, there's so much that we can't change, right? And it's so much really even within ourselves that we struggle to change. That's the only thing we technically have control over. And so how do we grow to have, to really find and understand and embody a bit more acceptance?
That's also part of mindfulness, really, of accepting things as they are. And that does take practice. That's why we call it a mindfulness practice. But I'll give you an example from my own experience. I was having a really bad migraine headache, and it was so painful. I was saying, oh boy, I can hardly stand this. This is just terrible. And and it feels exactly like somebody is putting pincers on my head or a vice on my head and screwing it down. And I was really painful, really in pain. And I thought for a bit, and then I really realized that I could shift my feeling to be more mindful. And I said, what if I stopped telling myself that somebody's screwing down a vice on my head and instead just notice the feelings that are present? So once I took the vice off, so to speak, in terms of that vice model off, and say, just notice the sensations, that actually the sensations weren't so painful anymore. There was pain sensations, but I said, well, what are the sensations? Once I started to accept, okay, they're present, but what are they like? It's actually kind of a tingling more than a pressure. And it was my model of applying, of saying that it was a vice that was making me suffer even more. So that's why they say that there's pain times the resistance is equal to suffering. You have a certain pain, like I had a certain pain of the migraine, but the resistance, the more I said, this is terrible, I have to get rid of it, I have to get that vice taken off, the more I suffered. When I let go of trying to escape that vice, I actually was much more able to cope with it. I don't know if that makes sense or if that's clear, but that's an example I found in my own life.
Yeah, thank you. That is a good example of, using mindfulness to deal with chronic pain. And, with MBSR, of course, that's, something that's been very helpful for people. And yet it sounds so counterintuitive, right? Like feel into the pain and it alleviates, but it is interesting how that works.
We add a lot to produce our own suffering. Robert Sapolsky called this adventitious suffering. In other words, needless suffering because of what we've added into it. He has a book entitled Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, and he talks about sort of the difference between humans and animals. If a zebra is trying to escape from a lion, they'll take off running, and as soon as they've gotten into safety, all their heart rate and their blood pressure all go back down to normal very rapidly. But humans tend to have it persist and keep worrying about what just happened. And it's the same thing with if you take an animal, a bear walking in the woods who gets a thorn in their paw. They don't, as far as we know, have adventitious suffering. A human who gets that might start to say, well, why did I get that? What did I do wrong? Was this related to my relationship with my mother or something? It could be any number of different things. But, it's all added on to that painful stimuli. And instead of just noticing what is the pain and how might I respond to it more skillfully.
I like that. I love the word skillful. And my last question for you is, the name of this podcast is Tranquility du Jour. So I'm curious for you as a psychiatrist, as an author, and I'm sure you have many other hats. How do you find tranquility in your everyday?
Well, I practice meditation on a daily basis, and that helps me find tranquility. I try to think of meditation as something, it's not if I'm going to do it today, but it's a matter of when. So it's kind of like brushing your teeth, it's building it into your daily habit. And that's one thing we find that works best for people is that if they make it a regular part of their day, if their practice makes it something they do regularly, and it may be any time in the morning, in the afternoon, the evening, when they wake up, before they go to bed, whatever. Just building it in can be very helpful. So building in that time of paying attention in a very specific way, bringing intention to forming your attention is really critical. And we find that actually alters brain function. So that in our study, we found that instead of the findings typical of depression, our 8-week program was actually able to shift brain function back towards normal using functional MRI. So this means that using this technique, it actually can alter brain function. It's not just smoke and mirrors. It's using our mind to change how our brain functions.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that reminder. And I really like the mention too of making it just like brushing your teeth, right? This idea of habit stacking or turning it into something where it's not like, oh, how will I make this happen? It's just when. Beautifully said. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Over in the show notes, you'll find a link to Stuart's website, his Facebook page, his Psychology Today column, and his book. And now I have a request for you. If you have a moment to share a review of any of my books over on Goodreads or Amazon, I would be so grateful. Or to write a review of this podcast. And you can find a link to all of this at KimberlyWilson.com/review. I wanted to read a review that came in from Tracy Miller about Year of Tranquility. She writes, when I first purchased this book, I wasn't 100% sure what I was getting in a lifestyle planner, as I usually use a day planner. After using this book in 2019, I've purchased a second copy for 2020, as well as the author's day planner. Kimberly's books include the standard reminders to track your most important tasks, but she goes well beyond that with weekly self-care reminders to nurture mind, body, spirit, creativity, and more. This isn't a book for listing appointments. Try her daybook for that. But this is the book to use to deliberately design your life and encourage your growth. Kimberly consistently over-delivers with additional resources in the book and online. Thank you so much, Tracy, for this incredibly generous review. And I'm so delighted that you are enjoying your Year of Tranquility planner. Also, head on over to KimberlyWilson.com/podcast for more episodes of this podcast that is now moving into, my goodness, its 15th year. Also, you can subscribe to the podcast using any of your favorite podcast apps, such as Spotify, Apple Podcast, or Overcast. And I have a link to each of these in the show notes, again, which is at KimberlyWilson.com/478. A gentle reminder, if you sign up for my mailing list, Love Note, you will get access to exclusive content, personal updates, giveaways, and Tranquil Treasures, which is a treasure trove of multimedia resources. Also, there's a link to my show notes and social media, along with my seasonless, locally sewn, eco-friendly fashion line, Tranquility. Now, if you are still with me, thank you so much for being here. I know that is a lot to cover. It's a mouthful. And I just want to say a big thank you for tuning in. I hope your 2020 is starting off strong and you're feeling good. And I can't wait to continue connecting with you as the year goes on. Please keep me posted on how you're doing. You can find me hello@KimberlyWilson.com. Wishing you a beautiful week ahead. Namaste.